we persuade readers that that we've done everything in the right way, and that our measures and analytical approaches are sound. So Anthea Zhang and Jason Shaw wrote a From the Editors column for AMJ. My editorial team under Jason Colquitt, Jason had us write a series of bumper to bumper From the Editors columns at AMJ, describing how to write different sections of an empirical article. And they wrote the section on methods and results, and they argued there are actually 3 C's that are important for effectively writing the methods and results sections. And I thought they're really good, so I'm going to apply them here. The first is completeness. The first C is completeness. You need to provide all the information necessary to assess the 4 types of validity in a method section, and to replicate the study if desired. So that's our goal, is to have a method section that's sufficiently complete that people can try to replicate what we did and have a reasonable shot at being able to do it without having necessarily provide every twist and turn. So some of the challenges in being complete in our discussion that I see in a lot of papers, and these go back to another section of my book, and when I describe some of the pathologies of academic writing and some of the techniques that we employ. So one of the big pathologies, one of the biggest I think that afflicts the methods and often has a results section, but particularly the methods section, is mind reading. So mind reading refers to things that you know that should be in the paper but don't make it there, but they're in your head. So in order for me to know how you did certain things, or what the outcomes were, or why you did what you did, I have to be able to read your mind, because you didn't write it down in the article. And so leaving things out of the article that are critical for the reader to know, or for somebody trying to replicate your method or your approach, are one of the biggest challenges. And they also call into account your credibility. Motion and pacing. So articles can move too fast or too slow. So they can have no motion at all and be sitting still, because you have these really long-winded descriptions. We go through things in excruciating detail, or they can be too short. And so we move really quickly and really briskly, but it's too fast, right? And we don't get all the necessary information that we need. Burying the lead refers to obfuscating or burying the subject of a sentence, the most important part of a sentence or a paragraph, by a long prefatory section. So a lot of times what we do, especially in method sections, when trying to justify or explain our choices, we lay all of our justifications out before we say what we actually did, as opposed to saying what we did and then explaining why we did it. And that's known as burying the lead. And sentence stuffing is simply trying to put all the information we can into a single sentence, as opposed to breaking them up and explaining them in shorter and clearer sentences, and using more sentences instead of fewer. And this often happens because we got so much we're trying to tell the reader about what we did that we end up stuffing too much into a single sentence. The second C is clarity. So with clarity, we use language and examples that both non-experts and experts can understand. So the biggest challenge to clarity, the fat suit is where we tend to lard our sentences with unnecessary words or unnecessary phrases, and our paragraphs with unnecessary sentences. So we bloat up what would be normally like a lean, clear, effective sentence with a lot of unnecessary fluff and blubber. Pompous prose is probably the biggest threat, though, to clarity. Although the fat suit's always a threat, in method sections in particular, pompous prose is a big problem, because pompous prose reflects using technical or obscure language, people who pump in tons of equations and treat equations as self-explanatory without explaining them in English using words. They don't define what the different symbols they use in their equations are, or they use overly technical terminology and make it hard to really actually understand what they've done unless you are experienced. Showing and telling refers to not just telling people what you did, but then providing examples, providing illustrations. So figures and tables are part of showing. Using examples that you walk through that illustrate how you went about creating a measure or constructing a variable are part of showing as well. And then cadence refers to the rate and the pace and the rhythm with which we explain things. And so usually people who have too forced a cadence, or there's not enough rhythm in what they do, this ties back to the motion and pacing, can also be a challenge to clarity, because we tend to get lost if we don't have the right cadence. The third C is credibility. So this is where the reader has to, because the reader has to trust that you did all the things they can see correctly. You make hundreds of decisions, perhaps thousands, in building and coding data and constructing your measures and conducting your analysis. You can only describe a small fraction of them, and you only want to describe a small fraction of all the decisions you have to make. So the reader has to trust that all the other stuff that you did that they can't see was done well also. And this is, again, where mind reading and showing and telling can play important roles. So what I'm going to do now is go through the different sections of the methods section and talk about the 3 C's within each of these, and how do we deal with or avoid creating some of the pathologies associated with them. So we typically open a methods section with a description of our context and our sample selection. So if you haven't described your context up to this point, you definitely want to do it now. And so if you're doing an experiment, this is where you want to describe who your participants were in your study. So if you have described your context, you might want to provide a little bit more detail or information, or at least remind readers what your context is for your study if you've already described it in detail. Provide relevant demographic statistics, other information that help us understand. If you're conducting an experiment, describe your participants and their relevant demographic characteristics so we know who it is you're studying. And then you need to describe your sample. So the sample description, this is where we identify where it's drawn from, how we constructed it. So the sample typically takes kind of a funnel sort of structure. So we start real broadly and describe, here is the overall potential pool that we drew from here, and then why and how there's attrition each level until we got to, here is my final sample. And so at each level you explain why you lost observations for different reasons, explain what they were, how many were lost, and then at the end you want to identify your observation structure. So are these individuals, are these firm years, what is it that, what is the observation structure that you're then using? And then you also want to provide some statistics if you can, or other information that shows, it demonstrates how and why your sample is representative of the larger population it's drawn from. So if you have some data on some of the actors or observations from the higher level that you lost, maybe you can compare them. Or if you're doing a survey and have you're addressing non-response bias, you can compare the folks who responded to the folks who didn't respond to the survey on some demographics on which you have them, to at least show that along those dimensions they are representative of the broader sample from which you drew them. And this will help with your statistical conclusion validity. This helps with your credibility. And so folks know who and what it is that you're studying and what the potential issues may be with that. After you describe your context and your sample, the next thing you want to do is describe your dependent variables. With very rare exceptions, I think it's always important to start with the dependent variables first. And if you think about it as describing your model, you're going to describe your DVs and you're going to describe your IVs. So I always like to list the dependent variables first, if I can. You want to clearly define the measure. So first, make it easy to see, here's what it is. So use bolding or italics or something, so we know what the label for, the measure label is for your dependent variable, and then define how you operationalized the measure. Describe any manipulations or transformations that you had to engage in. Did you log transform it? Did you have to standardize it and turn it into an index? How did you go about building that index? Provide any relevant statistics to assess validity and reliability of the construct or the measure. If this is a new measure, Make sure you provide the actual items in either in an appendix to the paper or in an online supplement, but let people see and know what it is that you actually asked if, for example, you developed a new scale. This also makes it easy for them to implement your scale in other studies if they like the measure. If it's not a new measure, if you're using somebody else's measure, then explain why this is the appropriate measure for you to use in your study. Or if you've adapted a measure, so you took somebody else's measure but changed some of the questions, make sure you provide the statistics so that people can see that that it's still valid and reliable, and show what questions, or explain what questions you changed and why you changed them to maybe make them more appropriate for your research context or whatever it was. After we listed all the dependent variables, I typically do them in the order in which they appear in the hypotheses if you have more than one dependent variable. Then we want to list the independent variables. And again, I would list them in the order in which they show up in your hypotheses. And I list the main effects first, and then I list moderators or mediators. And sometimes a variable you're treating as both having a main effect and maybe being a moderator or mediator of another relationship. That's fine, but we want to do them in the order in which you hypothesized about them. Keeping the order from the front end through the methods, through the results, really helps readers keep track of stuff, because they haven't lived with this study for all the years that you have, and it makes it a lot easier for a reader to keep things, keep track of things if they're in a consistent order. So list them in the order you do in the hypotheses, and all the same stuff with regards to manipulations, validity, reliability, etc. Do this for each of your independent variables as well. So this way you're being complete, and you're being clear about what you've done. You're providing examples of what you've done after you've constructed the measures, and people should be able to replicate what it is that you've accomplished, and you're ruling out some of these alternatives that people might be concerned about. Finally, the control variables, again, list them in the order that they're going to appear in your tables. If possible, I suggest grouping them by topic if there are kind of themes. So let's say you're studying executive compensation. You want to have a certain group of corporate governance variable controls, and so you include them. Or you need a set of industry controls or firm level controls, other things about the firms that you're controlling for, or personality traits or other individual characteristics. If you can group them and describe them that way, then it helps a reader see the relationships and the roles amongst the different control variables. When you describe them, make sure you provide a clear definition of how you operationalized it, and a short justification with the citation if possible for why you're including them, because there are challenges and problems with control variable proliferation in models, and they can actually affect your results. And so it's important to say, here's why I'm controlling for these things. They also help you address the 4 different validity threats and show that you're trying to rule out some of these different threats to validity, and that also enhances your credibility. And finally, clearly explain how you constructed each of these measures. So the final part of the methods section is the analysis, the data analysis. So in this section, you describing how you went about analyzing your data. So first, you want to clearly describe each statistical method used. As part of this, and this is something a lot of authors don't do, and everybody really should do, is you want to describe both the program you used, the version of the program you used, and any specific commands that you use to run the different analytical tools. Because over time, these things can change, and sometimes people discover in the algorithm used for a specific command and a specific version of software that there's a problem or a flaw. And by providing people this information, not only can they then use them in themselves, but over time, it allows people to be able to go back and understand, okay, we know that it turns out that there was a specific problem with the algorithm, and that helps them to be able to kind of reinterpret your results down the road. If you've used tests to determine which correct analytical approach, for example, if you did a Hausman test to decide whether or not you should do fixed effects or random effects, identify what tests you use, give the results, and then explain how that shaped your decision. Identify any assumptions that make this analytical technique appropriate. So why this one and not some other one? What is it about the structure of your data, the way you're going about doing your analysis, the questions that you want to answer that makes this particular approach appropriate to employ? If there are alternatives, or people may have different perspectives on this, discuss these alternatives and explain why you didn't use them. If you did try these, then you need to explain how your results either did or didn't differ. Unless you're going to go into this in detail in your robustness tests, and then you can just foreshadow that here and say, we also explored this using, thus and such a method, as we'll address more in our robustness test. These things can also be candidates for a footnote. So rather than going into a lot of detail here, if it's going to derail the flow of your story, you might just say in a footnote, we also tried